So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the LSE this evening to this event with Alistair Darling. He certainly somebody who doesn't really need introduction, but I will briefly rehearse his illustrious career. He has been an MP, an Edinburgh MP since 1987. A lawyer by training, he was educated at the University of Aberdeen. He's one of only 3 people to have served in the cabinet for the whole period between 1997 and 2010, where he was Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary of State for Scotland, Secretary of State for the Department for Trade and Industry, and then finally Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he took on the latter just as the full force of the financial crisis became apparent. And although I don't think it met with universal approval of all of his colleagues at the time, he's now frequently credited with having been one of the first leading politicians in the UK to have appreciated the severity of that crisis. And I'm sure we'll be exploring that in the conversation this evening. After taking a break from front bench politics, he's now playing a leading role in the Keep Scotland in Britain campaign, and indeed that may also be an issue that surfaces during our conversation. The way we're going to run it this evening is that I will pose, for the first part of the evening, I'll pose a few questions to Mr. Darling, and then at some point, when we feel there's a natural break in that, we'll open it up to the audience and you'll have an opportunity. There are roving mics, and I should, for those of you who are Twitterers, this is a technology rather beyond me, I should say the hashtag for this evening is LSE Darling. And might I also ask that you turn off your mobile phones, or at least have them on silent. I suppose if you're Twittering, you need them on, but make sure they're on silent, please. So let's begin. We're going to, the topic of this evening, of course, is the British economy, past and future. And I'd like to just begin with a question about the past. And if you think what's happened since, do you think the government, and I want to think of government over the, say, the 20-year period, not just the period of government where you're in the cabinet, do you think that the government was sufficiently attentive to developments in the UK economy over the past 20 years? I'm thinking of rising inequality, something I think we saw, and possibly one could say the government didn't pay as much attention to. One of your colleagues often would say he was relaxed about people becoming filthy rich, I think was the phrase.
I think he's recanted since then.
Yeah, okay. But other things like the growth in financial services, the decline in manufacturing, these kinds of issues. Do you think, looking back, there was more could have been done by government to respond to some of these developments?
Well, the short answer is yes, of course, and self-evidently you could always do more. But I think there are 2 distinct areas there that I might just like to comment on. Firstly, on inequalities, does it matter? Yes, it does, because I think a society where you have a growing gap between people who have high incomes and people who are not on low incomes, it isn't just morally wrong, and it is a moral issue as well. But I think it's economically very inefficient as well. You know, I would find it difficult to live in a country where people were supremely indifferent to the fact there were some people who were colossally wealthy, and there's other people living in conditions of poverty, you know, some of which are far worse than anything you'd find in this country. You know, yes, it is an issue. One thing I would say is that I think if you look back at the term of our government, for the first 5 or 6 years, we were, for understandable political reasons, very reluctant to say publicly we were actually redistributing wealth, even though we were. And it's one of the things that Gordon Brown did quite effectively before anyone actually noticed, especially through the tax credit system, which is quite topical now since there's a sort of slight rolling back there. But what we were trying to do is to put more money into the pockets of particularly parents with children. So, and what we did, I suppose, is we arrested the increase in inequality, and you know, child poverty, pensioner poverty came down. But you know, if you say to me, could we have done more? Then yes. There's also the broader question that you're asking, which of course is topical now, and that is in relation to the shape of the British economy. And here I think you do have to go back several governments, which cover obviously Labour, Tory, Labour then Tory again. And I think that if you ask yourself, why is it that our manufacturing industry is apparently so much of a lesser influence than it was, I think, frankly, that pass was sold about 30 years ago. And one of the questions being asked just now is, does a government in the 21st century need an industrial policy? And my answer is unequivocally, yes, it does. What happened was, in the 70s, there was a reaction against the state running things. The state used to run all sorts of things. It had British Airways, it had the steel industry, it had shipbuilding, and so on. And then as a reaction towards that, probably starting in the Thatcher government of 79, then they took the view that basically what you had to do was to get the macroeconomic environment right. And actually that view of the economy lasted throughout the 18 years of the Thatcher government and most of our 13 years in government. It wasn't until about 2008, which is really quite recently, that we were coming to the view that in today's world you cannot just simply stand back and hope that the market will produce what you need to produce. Now, a couple of points I'd like to make in relation to that. I'm not arguing you go back to the days when the state owned large pillars of the economy. I mean, you just can't do that now, and you wouldn't do it. And it's ironic because actually, here's me having nationalised more banks than anyone else since. But it's something I didn't actually want to do. If I was still a chancellor, I still wouldn't want to own a very large bank for a whole number of reasons. But I do think that government, especially now, where the centre of economic gravity is moving remorselessly from the west to the east to the south, and where governments on the other side of the world, and actually not so far away from us, are doing things that they wouldn't have maybe done in the past, you can make a difference. So I'll give you an example. Airbus, for example. Let no one tell you we're not good at engineering. If you take the Airbus A380, the big double-deck bus, its wings are made in Britain with carbon technology funded by the government. Rolls-Royce enjoys tax credits. Its engines are Rolls-Royce. Its landing gear is British. A lot of what navigates it is British. And actually, the French contribution, a lot of it's the nice bits, the furnishings and things that you see in the sound system and all that. But it is actually badged as made in France because that's where it gets glued together. Now, I make that point because actually I think there are things the government can do on that, on the creative industries, on some of the pharmaceuticals and so on. Not owning it, not handing out taxes, but they can make a difference. And I do actually think this is important because the financial service industry will remain important to this country and we should not give it away. But here is where I part company with the present government. I do think the government has got a role, and in the present circumstances, if we don't exercise that role a bit more, I fear that you're going to see a great further switch to the other side of the world, and we will become even more dependent on the financial services industry, and that is not a good place to be. So it's a much longer answer than I intend to give in the future, but you're asking rather a wide-ranging question.
Yeah. So let's go to the period when the banks got into trouble. I mean, you had a brief period you were mentioning of 6 weeks of stability when you first became Chancellor, but when did it? I guess that's quite a long honeymoon by normal standards. But it was, by Chancellor standards, at least at that time, seemed short. When did the severity of the recession or the coming recession really first dawn on you? What were the things that you saw that really began to get you seriously concerned and appreciate that this was going to be more than a short passing event?
Well, you're right. When I was appointed as Chancellor in June 2007, things looked absolutely fine. Of course, looking around the world, there were warning signs, but they hadn't really been brought together anywhere, despite what some people have subsequently claimed. There are people now who claim they saw it coming, they just forgot to tell anybody at the time. But so there were warning signs. And then you went into Northern Rock and so on. Now, I think I only once got seriously into trouble when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that was when I gave an interview to The Guardian in the summer of 2008, and I said that I thought this was likely to be the worst downturn in 60 years, and that it would arguably be more profound and long-lasting than people thought. And when I said that, the substances hit the fan on a style that was deeply unpleasant. All I can say is I'm very profoundly grateful to the people who caused all the trouble, because no one would have remembered I'd have said it if they hadn't done what they did. But why did I come to that view? It was mainly because, although in the autumn you might have thought that if you looked at Northern Rock, this was perhaps a case of a bank that had just overreached itself. It was depending on mainly America to raise money and so on. it was clear to me that when you looked at who else was affected, and you saw HBOS, for example, which is a middle-ranking bank, it wasn't a small bank, and you realised that despite what was being said by some of our near-neighbour governments, their banks were being affected as well. You realised, this was bigger than people might have thought, but the critical thing that was starting to go wrong was from the autumn of 2007, banks became increasingly reluctant to lend it to each other. That's something you've seen in Europe at the end of last year. Why was that? And the answer is because they were becoming aware that they were holding themselves a large amount of, I'd call them assets because that's what they were called in those days, of things they could not value. And increasingly began to wonder whether actually they had any value at all. These sliced up securities and so on, subprime mortgages and so on. What was becoming clear to me, though, was as each chief executive realised that he was sitting on this, it also occurred to him that if he was sitting on it, so was everybody else. And gradually, the banking industry realised they were all sitting on this stuff, and they became frightened of lending to each other, because they worried about being paid back. Now, the thing eased over the Christmas period of 2007-8 because the central banks of our country, the Americans, Japanese, Europe, and so on, made money available in a similar sort of way to, but not on the same scale as Mario Draghi has done with the ECB. It got slightly better in the spring of 2008. Then people thought, well, when it comes to the reporting season, everybody will fess up and say, look, we've been sitting on all this stuff, but it's all right, we're valuing it now. It became clear they couldn't do it because it was so colossal. So you then had, I remember when Bear Stearns collapsed about 3 days after my budget, which rather mucked up all the calculations that we'd made. The situation got worse and worse over the summer of that year. RBS tried to raise money, HBOS tried to raise money, and this was being replicated in America and Europe and so on. And I remember we had a meeting of Treasury officials in the summer, July I think it was, of 2008, when it was quite obvious that the banking system was very badly fractured, and that it was inevitable that was going to fracture the economic growth. It was clear at that stage we were probably going into recession. The timing wasn't clear, and that's why in August I was trying to prepare the way for. I think I've learned as a politician. We're always told we should tell the truth. It is a very hazardous occupation, believe you me, when you do this. But I think you do have to try and get people into realising that this was no ordinary downturn. It wasn't confined to our country. It wasn't even regional. It was global. And so I think it was just a combination of events coming together. There was just a bad smell about it, and unfortunately, this is precisely what's happened. The only thing I got wrong was 60 years. It wasn't. It's far worse than in modern times, really.
And of course, government acted in a number of ways, not least in the capital that was put into banks. But when you look back at the things that you did in office at that time, are there things that with hindsight you wish you'd done differently, or do you think you got it about right?
Well, look, if you go, the first thing that it would have been nice to have done differently is if regulators in every part of the world had seen what was going on, and in particular, if they had realised that you cannot simply pass a bank as as being healthy by looking at it alone. You've got to ask yourself, what's it dependent upon? What can go wrong that can affect the solvency of this bank? And frankly, that wasn't done properly. So there's that. There's undoubtedly there was. If you look at the way the economy was progressing a lot of the last decade, the imbalances we have between the West and the East were causing huge problems. And the growth, to a large extent, was being fueled by American consumers who were borrowing, a lot of money. It was happening in this country. So there's that. If you look at the crisis as a whole. I think it would have been probably better if we'd nationalised Northern Rock before we did, although in my defence, it's easy to say that now when nationalising a bank hardly raises an eyebrow. At that time, this was big stuff. You also had very litigious American shareholders who were trying to say that we'd acted precipitately and so on. I think as far as the banking crisis is concerned is, people will always say you could have done something differently. All I would say is that, when we did the bailout in 2008, we did more than people were expecting, and we did it more quickly than we're expecting. And if you want to road test the alternative to that, just look at what has been happening with Greece over the last 2.5 years, where it seems to me that the Euroland has been consistently behind events. And even now, nobody believes that what they've come up with in Greece is going to last more than, a few months.
So actually, let's pick up on that last point. So would you say that any notion of Britain never joining the euro is now essentially finished?
Well, you know, we could take bets on this if you want, but no, I don't see us joining the euro, frankly, in anything like the foreseeable future. And I'm not against it philosophically, but I mean, what this has shown in the last couple of years is that it's shown two things. One is, if you're going to have a single currency, you have to accept the consequences. And the consequences are you increasingly pool not just your economic sovereignty, but that takes you to the politics as well. And there's no way, I think, that Germans are not going to vote for a Euroland any more than Greeks are going to vote for it. But even a sort of getting there halfway, if you like, with Germany helping Greece adapt, or who knows, Italy or Spain, which is now already 4 days into, like 7 days into, in default of this new treaty they've signed. Unless you accept those transfers, then I just don't see how the thing is going to survive. And I honestly don't understand why. I do understand why that in politics you can't accept this, but I just think it's very difficult. So no, I don't think this is we're going to join. And if you want a sort of test of British opinion, the Scottish National Party was in favour of joining the euro until the beginning of this year, when it's now coming up with all sorts of alternatives to that. But it really tells you something that this issue is toxic in every part of the country.
So one legacy of the crisis, of course, was the fiscal deficit. And one thing the current government has done is to put in place the Office of Budget Responsibility. Do you think things would have been helpful to have had that in place already during, say, the period when you were in government? Would it have made any difference to the management of fiscal policy, do you think?
Well, look, I'm not against an Office of Budget Responsibility. I'm observing passing, its attempt at forecasting was no more successful than mine. So, it's terribly difficult to forecast in the time of a crisis. It's actually difficult to forecast when things are stable. Because forecast, it's like the weather forecast. You'll be approximately right, but almost certainly precisely wrong. And of course, in a crisis, people want to know what your growth figures are going to be. But I think anything that lends credibility to the process, and it's rather like the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. When we introduced that in 1997, it was controversial, but there's very few people around who would argue you'd go back to the old days of the government fixing it, because it gives credibility that non-political people are deciding what's appropriate. And actually, I think if you look at what's happening now with interest rates or quantitative easing, it helps that it's away from government. So the OBR, I think, is fine, but just remember, they've downrated their forecasts, I think, 4 times since 2010. It's not because they're bad people or negligent people. It's just it is very, very difficult to do it at this time. So yes, it might have helped in terms of credibility, although, frankly, if people want to have a go at you, they wouldn't distinguish as to whether it was the OBR or whether it's what you're doing. Is I'm sure Mr. Osborne will find out.
And coming back to growth and looking to the future, if you were in office now, would you be thinking that it would be necessary to relax fiscal policy somewhat as a growth stimulus, or would you look elsewhere to generate growth?
Look, the way I look at it is this: in the autumn statement, which took the place of the pre-budget report, that actually looked more like a pre-budget report than some of the ones I've seen in the past in terms of new announcements. The Chancellor had to announce he's borrowing £158 billion more than he expected to in 2010. And the reason for that, to a large extent, is because growth dried up in 2011. Now, we'll have to see what he's got to say about what we're looking forward to in the past. And it is that lack of growth that is causing us problems. It is that lack of growth which is going to cause Euroland huge problems, because, of course, they've now got an institutional requirement to actually exacerbate the situation. So, when the government says we would borrow more, and that's daft when your borrowing is going up, this is an argument which many of you in this institution will know was fought out in the 1930s between Keynes and Hayek. What do you do here? And I wouldn't have started in here. Don't get me wrong, deficits have got to come down. Debt's got to come down. I chose to halve the deficit over a 4-year period because I thought we could do it. It would have been very painful. We'd have had a lot of political trouble. But actually, if you look at where the government's ending up, it's not a million miles away from where I thought we were going to end up. The difference is that they're not getting the growth. So I do think that I would be looking at things that would stimulate growth. I think there are 3 areas I would look at. One is in respect of the incomes of basic rate taxpayers, and also in people on low incomes, whose incomes at the moment are being squeezed, if not cut. And that is hitting spending power. People in that position are just not going to go out and buy goods and services and so on. The second is young people unemployed. That is a huge political problem, and it will become a greater political problem as well as being an economic problem. And the last thing that I think I would look at is, here I've got a limited sympathy for Vince Cable on this, and that he did sign up for all this. But I think actually the signals we send in terms of coming back to your earlier point as to where this country is going, I think some of the big infrastructure projects I think need to be looked at. I think the government needs to rethink its policy on Heathrow, because that, if we're not careful, is going to go into a long-term decline. But I would, in addition to the big projects, I'd also look at some of the things you can do, like housing, for example, where consents are granted. It doesn't take long between ordering a house and actually getting one. And if you want to sort of get people back into useful employment, you could do that. Now, obviously George Osborne has made a point of saying, I will never change my policy, otherwise the markets will go against me. So he's put himself in a slightly different position to the one I would be in. And therefore he will obviously need to look at where else he can get money from. But, if he was sitting here, I can tell him the easy pickings are long gone. And you don't have to go too far before you start hurting people. As you'll see this debate about child benefit at the present time, a lot of people earning 43,000 quid a year don't actually think they were, at the top end of the income scale.
So one thing we've done here at the LSE is to set up a growth commission, which I'm one of the co-chairs. And one message that we got from some of our initial hearings is that there's been a long-standing set of issues. You mentioned transport. In fact, you were Secretary of State for Transport, where we sort of know what to do. I mean, think of airport expansion. It's no news that the UK, London in particular, is going to be starved of airport capacity. Many of the transport links between our major cities, there's no news that. But somehow there seems to be a kind of sclerosis in government that means these things don't get easily translated into progress. Is that a fair criticism, and is it the case that that's going to be an impediment to generating growth?
It is, and it's largely planning. Let me give you an example. In 2003, I opened the M6 expressway around Birmingham. Now, anyone who's been up that part of the world will know that this is the one you pay the toll, and you can get around Birmingham half the time it takes to go through the middle of it. And I remember when I was opening it, I did the usual round of interviews, and there was one woman from the BBC said, clearly rather more partisan than she might have been, she said, "This must be a great day for the Labour Party." And I said, yes, indeed it was. Had Harold Wilson still been alive, he'd have been very pleased indeed. And I said that, for those of you who don't know, Harold Wilson was the Prime Minister between 1964 and 1970. That is when this thing was planned, and it didn't appear in 2003. Now, I'm afraid, I actually supported George Osborne's list of infrastructure projects that he announced last autumn. And one reason I supported them is because I distinctly remember announcing at least half a dozen of them myself. and they are no more ready for completion or ready to go now than they were when I announced them. And there's a real problem in this country. We decide we need some infrastructure, but it takes years to get it. Now, we're up against countries on the other side of the world where, frankly, planning is not a great issue. In China, for example, the main airport in Shanghai and Beijing were both built within 4 years, because their planning consent process is rather different, shall I say, to the one that we have in this country. But if you take Heathrow, which we looked at this 10 years ago, there's a perfectly good serviceable white paper which we produced in 2003, and the issues have not gone away. And the idea that you can sort all this thing out by building a new airport in the middle of the Thames, which is going to cost a fortune. Airlines will not pay the charges. They will say, well, if that's the choice, let's go to Schiphol or Paris and so on. And the one thing that is going to defeat this project, that defeated everybody else who's looked at airports in the Thames, is it happens to be the sort of the equivalent of the M6 for migrating geese. And you cannot land large aeroplanes if you're having to negotiate very large numbers of very large geese who are flying around you. It just isn't going to get built. And I know the difficulties in Heathrow. As anyone living in West London, I do understand that there are difficulties. But if we don't do this, it isn't just people who are going to flying around the world and the rest of it. The M4 corridor depends to a large extent on Heathrow. If people have got houses in West London, a large amount of it, the prices are being kept up by Heathrow. It employs, I think it's nearly 100,000 people from recollection, one way or another, depend on that airport. Take it out of West London, which is what moving it somewhere else ultimately means, and you will make a huge impact. This is an example of where, I was saying earlier, there are some industries that we do have a competitive advantage in, financial services. One, actually, Heathrow brings a lot of money into this country. Even people who don't actually come out of the airport, they transit through the thing, and they do generate a lot of employment. And I do think this is something that the government's going to have to look at. We have to make our minds up. What are we going to do? It's not the only example. And by the way, High Speed 2, the thing that's called High Speed 2 just now, it is very nice to get to Birmingham 10 minutes before we presently do. But it is no substitute for Heathrow, and actually when you get to Birmingham you still need to deal with the communications within that city and indeed other cities. So yet you're absolutely right, planning, the lack of drive that we have there. I could mention a whole lot of things. Our power stations need replacing and so on. This is something where I think actually the government could send a very, very powerful signal. But already you get the clash of localism, which means people saying no, not in my backyard, and the strategic necessity. Now, we have to resolve that.
Mm-hmm. And let me try another thing, which is, I've heard it said that there's a concern that we're losing the perception of an enterprise culture in the UK. Now, people talk about banker bashing as just a sort of backhand way of trying to, if you like, denigrate wealth creation of a sort. Now, of course, whether it was wealth creation or not is an open debate, but the whole question of whether we're sending out a perception, whether the perception of the UK is we're not as open for business as we were in a prior period. Do you subscribe to that view, or is the view that's...
Up to a point. It is true that if you go to America, or I was in Hong Kong recently, their perception of Britain has changed. I was actually surprised. And ironically, the thing that was sort of driven that was, to a large extent, what happened to Fred Goodwin. Now, this is the most unlikely hero, in this country, for obvious reasons. I don't carry any flag for him. He's the author of his own misfortunes. I told him at the time that if he insisted on holding on to this pension, he would end up in tears. But the fact that the government went along with stripping him of his knighthood in a way that was inconsistent with the current rules, because you can only lose it if you're imprisoned or you're disciplined. Whatever you think of him, the rules were changed. And if for a country that believes in the due process and believes in the rule of law, I think that's a bad signal to send out. On bankers generally, it is perfectly understandable why the public, especially if you are being squeezed, and a lot of my constituents in Edinburgh actually work for these banks and don't earn vast sums of money, are very angry about what happened. It's understandable when someone is apparently paying themselves huge bonuses for not a lot, or in some cases, the more you lose, the more you get. It is terribly difficult to justify that. My only point about the financial services is not really about bonuses, is that do remember this is an industry that employs 1 million people in this country, and it is something where a lot of towns and cities depend on it, my own home city included. I'm not sure that we, I think the world is looking at Britain saying, they're anti-enterprise, but I do think, signals do actually matter, and I would not argue that, we're going to be banned from saying that excessive bonuses are a bad thing. I just think we need to, criticise where it's needed, but also where we're good at something, or where we actually think it's of value to our country, then we should be ready to say that. My broader point on growth is that I think the signals we would send in terms of, yes, we are going to be serious about replacing our energy sources, our infrastructure and so on. I think that would all send a positive signal as well. There's other things too, like the immigration cap. This, which is hitting a number of universities, having difficulty getting people in, or the messages we send to students coming from outside this country, the argument of which, of course, has been around since the 1960s. I do think it's important on the signals we send. I want this to be an open, vibrant economy where we welcome people to come and do business. We just sometimes have to think about what we say. But believe me, trying to defend bankers is a hopeless task. And I used to find it especially galling when I had to defend them when they were earning several times more than I'm ever likely to earn and weren't prepared to even put in an appearance on the Today programme. So there you are.
So in that context, how do you think now of the 50 pence tax rate? Because some people will point to that now. Did you, when you implement it, think of it as a temporary measure, or do you think it's now going to be part of the UK fiscal landscape for foreseeable?
No, when I introduced it, I said it was temporary and for the duration of this crisis. And I think, politically, I don't think we'll remove it from the budget in 2 weeks' time. But if we really are all in this together, if your first tax cut is the 50 pence rate, I think you are. You're in politics, so you want to think seriously about whether you've got a better future somewhere else. But I've always said that your tax rates have to be kept competitive vis-a-vis the countries in which you are basically competing with. which is, and I defended, I've been part of a government that had a top rate of tax of 40p for 10 years, and my views haven't changed on that. And my guess is that it will come down at some stage. But again, for a country like ours, where we are very dependent on inward investment, you have to make sure that your tax rates are generally competitive. So I'd be surprised if it won't go. I don't think in 3 weeks' time. They may want to say something about it. However, if the alternative is a mansion tax, whenever you come up with a new tax, I think your hope is you're never around when someone tries to implement it, because they're easier announced than they are implemented.
So one final question, and I'll throw it open to the floor. But I can't. You were surrounded by economists in the Treasury, I'm guessing, giving you all sorts of advice. And I don't know what view of economists you took by the end of the crisis. Do you have any advice for the economics profession from your experience as Chancellor? Do you think we're all a waste of time?
Simply to try and reach agreement or something. No, the economists are no different from anybody else. They've all got their views, got your views. It is sometimes trying when people give you excellent academic advice, which doesn't actually pass what I call the Tesco test. You try it out on an ordinary person and see what they think about it. But I think from this institution of all, this would not be a great place to launch an attack on the profession. But
I think that many people would be very pleased if you did.
Well, it is an ouch in a quick way out that way. Last time I was here, I came through that. So of course, there's an absolute essential part of it. But it's sometimes an overly academic approach to something can sometimes be counterproductive. I think we can think of many examples of where that's been done.
Yeah. Very good. So I think what we'll do now is take some questions from the floor. Can I ask you to keep your questions reasonably brief, to say who you are, and to wait for a microphone to travel to you? It was that little group just on the top right that first caught my attention. There'll be 2 mics, and I'll sort of take one after the other. So why don't you go up the back, and we'll take someone from this side afterwards, okay? Start up there.
Hi, I'm Ramin, member of public. Could you comment on quantitative easing, please?
Okay, answer one time.
I think that's
okay, right. Quantitative easing must be a good thing, because I announced it 2 years ago. Let me say this. Firstly, I think it is part of the armoury, if you like, that the central bank needs once interest rates come to such a level as they cease to have any of the normal effects you would have. When we started this in 2009, it was part of a range of measures designed to stabilise the banking system. That was the main purpose of it. In the same ways, the European Central Bank is doing that now. It has subsequently been used last autumn and then again more recently. My concern about it now is that the declared aim is that the bank is putting this money into the banking system in the hope that it is then lent out onto the high street. Now, I don't believe it is. And I think this is something the government does need to look at. I know that it's got this thing called its credit easing programme, which they announced last autumn, and which is supposed to come in, I think, very soon actually, but I'm not sure how it's going to work. But at the moment, I think there is something of a problem where, on the one hand, we're wanting banks to be safer by making them hold more capital, telling them to be more careful who they lend their money to and all that. It means that the price of credit is going up and it's going to be more constrained. On the other hand, we're putting money into the system, hoping that it will get out. And I really think that the government needs to take a little bit more, a more proactive approach in ensuring that the money that is coming into the system actually finds its way out of the bank vaults into the wider economy, because otherwise it will not have the same effect as cutting interest rates. There's no point in simply transferring it one bit of the banking system to another. It won't have the economic effect unless it actually finds its way out into the wider economy. Now, maybe in the budget, when the Chancellor announces more details of the credit easing, we'll see more about this. But at the moment, I'm doubtful about that. But in terms of philosophy, I remember at the time people said it was the last act of a desperate government. Well, if it is, there must be a lot of desperate governments around, because a lot of people are doing it. I'm less concerned at the moment about how you unwind it. In fact, I'm looking forward to the day when we can actually begin to unwind these things. But I think as a policy it's okay, but the practice of it I'm not sure is working.
Okay, I'm going to go to the left. Could you pass it along to someone you can see there? And, yeah, everyone should be able to get it eventually. So.
Hi there, my name is Noah and I'm from the Queen Mary Labour Society. I wonder what you think about the current Labour economic plan, because you said when you left office that Labour needs a credible economic plan. So do you think Ed Miliband's and Ed Bull's economic plan is credible? And if so, why do you think they're doing so badly in the polls?
Right, well, firstly, as the economic policy is still the same as the one I left, yes. The answer to the first one was yes. I say this for the benefit of anyone who's listening from outside, twittering or otherwise. I'm not proprietorial about this. As we go through this Parliament, I suspect the opposition and the government's economic policy will adapt to take account of circumstances. And the big question that I think is going to face us over the next couple of years ago is the growth question, which I referred to earlier on. On your political part of your question, if you like, I think that there's no doubt that we paid a heavy price for both being, divided on what our approach would be about reducing the deficit in the back end of our government in 2009, 2010. And there's no doubt also that the present government was hugely successful in persuading people that A, the country was the same as Greece, which was mendacious on any view, and B, that it was all our fault that borrowing was built up because of profligacy and so on. We were doing that while we had a 6-month leadership campaign where obviously we spent more time talking to each other rather than talking to the population at large. And that is something that, frankly, we have to turn around. In the same way as the last government, the last Conservative government, had when they had the problems of the exchange rate mechanism and Black Wednesday and all that sort of stuff in 1992, it took them a long time to recover from that. Now, I'm afraid you just have to be realistic about it. There's no point pretending it's not an issue. It is an issue. By the time of the next election, there may be a different set of circumstances, and the question that people will then ask is, well, looking at the two potentials, the present government, leaving aside the complications of the coalition, or a Labour government, which of the two have got the most compelling and credible policy, which both sides will need to be in possession of. I'm quite sure that as we go on, the policy that we have, obviously the dividing line will not be the rate of reduction of the deficits. It's actually, as I said, the present government is now doing the same as we're doing, but the policies will adapt, and that's how it should be.
I'm going to work the microphone guys quite hard, and you're going to come down the front now. I'm going to sort of go front and back, left and right, so you'll be well exercised by the end of it. There we go. Come down the front. This gentleman here, you caught my attention.
You want me to come down the front?
No, I wanted him to come down. Okay. You can stay where you are.
I'm Dan Pilson. I'm a retired civil servant, very junior, before I retired. Back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, we had something called Butscalism, based on the names of Hugh Gaitskell and Rab Butler, who were Chancellors of Exchequer. And essentially, they believed that you could manage the economy by a touch on the tiller, purchase tax regulator, tweaks, in short. And the recurring cartoon image of the last 60 years has been of a desperate Prime Minister and Chancellor at the helm of a ship, often hitting an iceberg. Do you think that the Labour Party developed an over-strong belief in the ability of government to manage an economy at all, and its faith in touching the tiller, as it were, was too strong and tested to the extreme by the events of 2007 onwards? And is there anything, by the way, which you would have done differently with benefit of hindsight between 2007 and 10? That's the second question.
On the latter point, I mentioned a couple of things we would have done differently. But I think, of course I understand Butscalism. I may have been at school at the time, but I do remember the term. I think what's different is our economy in the 50s and 60s was, compared with what it is now, was relatively closed. The ability of government to touch tillers and so on was rather greater than it is now. Our economy now is pretty open. And globalization, you talked about that in the 1950s and 60s, it had been terribly difficult to, if there was globalization, it was confined to only, one small part of the globe. It's just, the world is just different from then. I think, governments can make a difference, but we are totally interdependent of each other. Of course it makes a difference what you do, whether or not you have the right economic environment in which people work. But where I think I might take issue with you, unless I've misunderstood you, surely 2007 to 2010, actually showed that if government doesn't do something, it can make one hell of a difference. People have subsequently said to me, why didn't you let RBS collapse? And there's quite a simple answer to that. Look what happened 12 months before that, when you had Northern Rock people queuing around the block, even being told their money was guaranteed and it was safe. People would say, I know that, but I still want it out. If the largest bank in the world had shut its doors and its cash machines went off, and remember, on the morning of the 7th of October 2008, when I was phoned up by the chairman, he said, when I said, how long have you got, thinking he might say 2 or 3 days, he said, we're going to run out of money in 2 or 3 hours. Now, no one's going to tell me that governments couldn't make a difference, which is my complaint about the Euro governments, which could have made a huge difference, actually, they bothered to do it. But I think if you look at the broader economy now, as I said earlier, and I don't want to repeat myself because lots of people want to ask questions, I think the model that we use is entirely different from the 50s and 60s, and certainly by the 1970s. But I do think that governments can actually make a difference in terms of the infrastructure they provide, in terms of some of the incentives or some of the encouragement they can give to industries where we've got a competitive advantage. I do think that can make a difference, and that's why I think that if you look at the economic models that are followed, and there usually is a consensus in the political parties about these, despite the fact the more they say there isn't, it usually means there is. There was a different one in the 60s and 70s, there was a different one in the 80s and 90s, and what I'm saying is I think there needs to be a different one now.
Down the front on the end.
Toby Chambers, We Care Foundation. There's been a lot of debate that we're following in the path of Japan, and it really haven't sort of dealt with the banks, really. And you talked about equality and the kind of inequality that's really occurring, and it can't be right that you sort of let the banks sort of scot-free without any sort of strings attached, and now they're sort of still getting up to the same sort of paying massive bonuses when really the taxpayer has actually bailed out and their bonus.
Okay, there's a Japan question and there's a banks question. It's not true there were no strings attached. However, I would just make this point to you, that whatever a bank, if you take the top bankers just now, whatever they earn, even if you halved it and halved it again, people would think, well, that's still too much. Now, there is an issue in relation to banks. There are very few industries in the world where employers almost collude in paying their employees more and more money. The only place they used to do that was in the football industry, and even now they're beginning to realise that paying someone a large sum of money for sometimes not doing very much is not such a good idea. But in banks, they're still doing it. And it's not helped by the fact that if you go to America or Asia and you talk about excessive pay or bonuses, they look at you blankly because they don't actually think it's a problem. They're in a completely different position to us. I do think that we need to look at the amount, the industry needs to look at the amount that it pays in relation to the total remuneration as well as bonuses, which sometimes, and the whole idea of a bonus is it's something special, something extra. In this particular industry, it is usually more than someone is paid in their base salary, and it can often distort their behaviour, sometimes in a very negative way. However, it's a difficult thing for one country to sort on its own when you've got an industry that is extremely global. In relation to RBS, for example, where I was there when the current chief executive was hired, but I had to get somebody who was capable of running this bank and trying to retrieve the very large sums of money that the British taxpayer is exposed to. On your Japanese point, maybe people who know better than me here, I do understand the concept of the lost decade. What's depressing is if you ask Japanese people why it's happened, nobody really knows why it's happened. It's just there. What my suggestion, my analysis of it is that really Japan is an object lesson where people totally lose confidence in recovery, and they just respond accordingly. They behave like human beings, say, well, I'm not going to spend money, I'm not going to do new things. And I think that actually is quite a real risk in this part of the world if we're not careful. At best, the greater risk is that it all goes terribly wrong again, and it won't be too much to get it going. We're talking about banks. We actually did, to a large extent, sort out some of the rubbish in our banks in 2008. That did not happen in a large part of continental Europe. The problems are still there.
I'm going to go top right again. Just pass it along. Yes, pass it down.
Hi there. My name's Edward Scott. I work in the library in the House of Lords. I've got a question about how to get money lent to businesses to get them to grow again. The idea has been floated that we should take advantage of the fact that we own large chunks of the banking industry, create a new entity which the government manages to lend to companies to ensure growth. Is that idea viable, and is it something that the government should do?
Well, I'm not, I only know what I've read in this leaked document. If it just seems to me that what Vince Cable's on about is using the high street network of RBS to pay money out, which you might argue you can do that. If he's going further than that and saying, well, actually, we're going to lend more money, it must mean, therefore, two things. One is the government's going to change the lending criteria, in other words, it'll be easier to get a loan. But it also must mean the government's prepared to stand behind these loans if they go wrong, because somebody's got to do it. And obviously, for this purpose, even if you said RBS was doing it, who is RBS in practice? Well, it's us, because we own it. I have my doubts about it. I mean, China has done something similar. In 2008, they got their banks to lend money, quite extensively to individuals, to businesses, to local authorities. And as one Chinese minister said to me, we don't have any trouble persuading our bank managers to lend money. But I notice now they do have a real problem, because a lot of their regional government can no longer afford to repay this money, which is now becoming due, and they're talking about rolling it over and so on. I would be nervous about getting ourselves into a situation where, if this is what he's suggesting, the criteria so changes that you end up lending a lot of money, which you may come to regret in years to come, because it all goes bad. I would prefer, and I think the government may have something in this credit easing. If you borrow money on the strength of the British government and then lend it out, you can do it at lower rates. But somebody has got to assess at some stage whether or not something is a good risk or not. And certainly in my experience, yes, there are many examples where people are not getting money. That the banks really they should step up to the mark. But you do come across cases where you think, well, I can see exactly why HBOS is bust, for example, in some of the property development and so on. So, it really depends on what you're trying to do, but I don't think it's a panacea. Also, by the way, I think you need to look at the other side of it. Until you've got businesses confident that there's going to be growth, then you're not going to borrow more money to hire more people or to build new plant and machinery or whatever. I think the two things need to go together, and I think the lack of confidence is, part of the problem we've got at the moment.
Right, let's go up. We're going to go up to the left, go halfway, and then pass it into the middle of the row. Stop there, into the middle of the row. Yeah.
Hi, Chloe Sorovich, Lambeth CLP. Do you think that the UK has anything to learn from the German economic model?
Well, it's certainly got something to learn in terms of manufacturing, because the Germans managed to hold on to their manufacturing in a way that we didn't. Now, I think there's all sorts of reasons for it. Whether or not it's their structure, I don't know. I mean, I've always thought that there is something in the argument that a lot of German companies were family-owned long after we stopped having family-owned industries, and the owners therefore felt they owned it. And if you compare and contrast that with, say, take an extreme example, Cadbury's chocolate was obviously built up by the Cadbury family, and they cared deeply about it, and there was sort of the model of Victorian, entrepreneurs, if you like. They cared about their employees. When Cadbury's was eventually, taken over, a large number of its shares were owned by people who bought it for the purposes of the takeover. Who, probably people who were buying the shares had never been here, probably didn't know what Cadbury's was particularly, had no interest in it whatsoever. And I think, that sort of culture does lead to short-term decisions being taken, the reluctance to invest on something that may take a return, it may take a number of years to get a return on. And so I think that aspect of Germany is quite important. I mean, of course you could say, if you look at some of our great British companies, who owned industries in the Victorian times, there's no doubt that they were as guilty as anybody else of neglecting to invest properly, especially after the First World War and after the Second World War, and we paid a heavy price for that. Now, you can't roll the clock back, but I do think, the sense of ownership, the sense of commitment for a longer period than the next quarter is something that I think we do need to look at. It's something that I think actually both governments have looked at. We looked at it. How you actually achieve it is something that I don't have a ready answer for. And by the way, in case you think despite what you sometimes hear from the Germans, and they sometimes were critical of what we did in 2008. They absolutely poured money into their motor industry in 2008. They put more money into their economy than we did because they were determined they were not going to lose the competitive advantage they had in, not just the motor industry, but the spin-off that goes with it. I think there are things that we can learn. Though whether now, when so much has happened, you could ever go back to, you can't reinvent the Canterbury family or anything like that for obvious reasons. But I do think it's something that we need to look at.
Just a quick supplemental on that. One other thing that people point out about Germany is they have a much better system of skills and apprenticeships. Yeah. Is that something you think the UK should be focusing on as well?
Yeah, one of the things they've got is that they persuade sections of the industry is much more organised than ours, and it's rather like the old trades and guilds that we used to have, and that German companies readily accept that there is a cost in training, engineering apprentices, for example. So people talk about our labour costs being too high. The Germans, the labour costs are high, sometimes for very good reasons. Again, this is a past that was sold 30 years ago, where basically firms didn't think it was their job to train people up. The good ones do, and Rolls-Royce, for example, which undoubtedly has a worldwide leadership here, they do and always have recognised that unless they train people, no one else is going to do it for them. But for a lot of companies, I'm afraid they didn't do it. Successive governments, especially in the 80s and 90s, have tried to find elaborate ways of not putting burdens on business, because that is a bad thing in inverted commas, and then trying to cobble together, training and apprenticeships and so on. And some of the best training is actually on the job, and I think that is something that we lost sight of.
Right, down to the front here on the right, please.
Thank you. My name is Yan Ting from China Business News. I have 3 simple questions. First, do you think China should come to Europe's rescue? And second, in your view, what will be the end game of the Eurozone crisis, and should Greece take a sabbatical from the Eurozone? Third, what do you think of China's intention to invest in UK's infrastructure sector? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll try and... You'll obviously go far as a journalist if you only got 3 simple questions to answer. Firstly, the role of China in the development of the global economy is pivotal. One of the things that I was encouraged by in the beginning of 2009 was, I remember, when there's an annual exchange between the Chinese government and the British government. It's trade orientated, and we take it in turns. We go there, they come here, and so on. They were here in 2009. And they were engaged in a way that I had not seen in the 3 previous years. They, like everybody else, were terrified about what was happening within the economy. They have always wanted, as you know, to become more involved in world institutions like the IMF and so on. But they recognised that they had to be contributors to this debate as well. There is this sort of thing that I've always found with both China and India. They can at one and the same time being saying, look, we are now major economies, we want at the top table, rightly so. And of course you say, well, how about like the environment? Well, we're developing countries, you lot sort this problem out, and then when you have them, we'll come along and do things. But I welcomed that development. I was very sad that by the end of that year, I remember it was the finance ministers meeting, the G20 finance ministers meeting, which we held in St Andrews in Scotland. Both China and India had completely bailed out of it. The crisis had gone and they were just withdrawing. So I just made that general point. I think China must be part of the solution here, particularly when you're talking about, as I said, this problem you've got with China, the imbalances between China and the United States, for example. They've got to be engaged. They've got to be alive to this. In relation to, which brings me on to China's interest in Europe, am I surprised that the Chinese took one look at the rescue fund last November and said, we'll come back next year and see how you're doing? No, I'm not. Because the obvious thing is, how come Germany, which has got plenty of money actually to be able to contribute to this if it wanted to, it's not going to do it? Why should China be putting its money into it? And you were asking about how they handled this thing. It's been a series of disasters, actually. We first tried to sort it in the last finance meeting of the European ministers I ever went to, in the interregnum between us losing power and the new government being formed. And we put together, after several hours, a smallish rescue fund to provide cover, frankly, for the European Central Bank to start buying bonds and so on. The money never materialised. They then had 2 other attempts where it was too little, they were chasing events. And now, although there is a fund, it is a virtual fund. Indeed, it enjoys many of the characteristics of the subprime mortgage market in the United States. It's what as they say in the trade, leveraged, except it's not quite clear who's doing the leveraging. I don't think that's satisfactory, and it's certainly not big enough as a big country got into the state of affairs. Of course, I welcome cross-border investment. But and I have no problem with sovereign wealth funds, with the one proviso: you have to play by the rules. It has to be a commercial endeavour, and there's always going to be questions about that. And not this particular one, but sovereign wealth funds, full stop. On your last point about the sabbatical of Greece. My view is that it's an obvious one. Greece should never have got in there in the first place, but it is. I think a disorderly departure would be a disaster, and it would not be confined to Greece. It would spread, and it wouldn't stop at just another small country. People would start looking at some of the bigger countries and saying, fundamentally they've got problems as well. Even an orderly departure in the current climate, I think, would lead to difficulties because suppose you were able to help them out. Just think of the practicalities. Could you honestly keep secret the fact that Greece was going to leave the euro on Monday morning while you rustled up a new currency, and you put in all the measures to stop there being a complete panic and meltdown? It just wouldn't happen. And the minute people thought this was going to happen, what would the reaction be in Italy, Spain, Portugal? They would all say, hold on, if it can happen there, it can happen out in other places. So I think in the current climate, I think to this extent the Eurozone is right, that it should do its best to try and help Greece adapt. But I conclude on this point: how on earth can you think it is a credible solution to visit upon a country something that, even if it works, even if the Greeks do every last thing they're being asked to do, in 8 years' time it will have a debt of 120% of its GDP? This is in a fragile economy which does not, with due respect, doesn't have a great track record on these things. It is simply not credible. And indeed, the Eurozone knows it. They know they're going to be short and they're going to be coming back. And until you get a credible solution for Greece, I go back to my point about our bailout. These bailouts only work if you do something that people say, yeah, that makes sense. Even if it doesn't make sense for the rest of the time or anything like that, but it has to make sense for at least a credible period of time. And no, it's not doing that, which is why, when people say, will the Eurozone be in the same form as it is now in 5 years' time? Well, a year ago, 18 months ago, I would have said yes. I'm not so sure now.
So just following on that, so is your sense that the politicians of the Eurozone are in a sense delusional in believing that they have solved the problem of Greece?
It's like everything else in Europe. A lot of it's all compromises. It's all about buying time. I understand fully that if you read the German tabloid press, it's not surprising that German people are not, as a whole, terribly well disposed towards Greek people, because the picture they have is one that is not entirely flattering. And I understand entirely the politics of this. Especially if you're a German politician, you've got an election next year, actually saying, look, we're going to give lots of money to Greece and so on. It's not easy to do it. But I think the other question is, Germany has done exceptionally well out of the euro. In fact, the last thing Germany wants is the Deutschmark. That wouldn't really help their manufacturing industry, I wouldn't have thought, just at the present time. But I think that if you ask the Eurozone members, they're buying time for Greece. I honestly don't know, because I cannot get anyone to explain to me how the treaty they have signed up to, which means that a country that is in recession is effectively going to have to exacerbate the situation and do everything that in the 1930s people thought actually is a bad thing. How on earth that helps you, I do not know. And when actually, as I said to you earlier on, within days you get a right-of-centre Spanish government which is signed up to austerity, and the day afterwards, I think, the Prime Minister said, by the way, we're not going to meet the criterion, it doesn't apply to us. I mean, it doesn't really encourage you, does it?
Okay, we're going to top left now, so if somebody could indicate that they wish to pass down that. Yeah.
Hi. The former Icelandic Prime Minister, Geir Haarde, has just gone on trial for negligence for his part in the financial crisis. Imagine we were to do the same in Britain. Who would you have the Metropolitan Police arrest? Gordon Brown, Adair Turner, Mervyn King, or you?
Well, it won't surprise you to know that whilst I'm not a great fan of the former Icelandic Prime Minister, I wonder whether the criminal law is the best way of dealing with these things. I've also noticed what he's been saying about me along the way. I mean, the Icelandic government was very irritated when we froze the assets of one of their banks here, and we had to use, because it's the only legislation we had, legislation that's contained within a terrorism act, and I understand the sensitivities of it. All I would say is that when I spoke to the said Prime Minister and asked him, to stop removing money from this country, the money was in this bank, because, it was mean that we would have to underwrite it. He said to me that he wasn't fully abreast of what was happening, could we negotiate? And, I said no, we couldn't, and I see that now apparently I was acting rather unreasonably. I think the Icelandic government was getting into trouble, and it sort of illustrates the problem of what happens when you have a small country which, basically its banks develop out of all proportion to what the country's got. I mean, Ireland had something similar. But in Iceland, I don't know if you're aware of it, there's something, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and I think you will find, and this isn't trying to defend me or any other of my co-defendants that you named, though incidentally, if we're going to start, widening the net, how's about my successor who said that the Irish model of regulation is one that we should choose to emulate? That was in 2006. I just think you need to realise that there's an awful lot more going on in Iceland than just the management of the economy. There was a lot of other things that you need to look at, but by being a former lawyer, I will go no further at this stage.
Very good. We're kind of going in the middle here, because I think I've been top and bottom, so perhaps find somebody in the middle of the pack.
I'm Vlad Tomes from Langton Boys School in Kent. I was wondering, would have state spending, instead of cutting, been more effective in creating growth in the economy?
State spending? Yeah. Well, let me take a step back. If you look at the big question just now, the deficit, how did it arise? And the reason it arose is that when the economy started going into a steep decline in 2008, we maintained spending, as indeed did the Americans, the Chinese, most other countries. It was a classic Keynesian response, because government cuts back when everybody else is cutting back, nobody's spending, the risk is you go into a depression. I'm always clear that once the economy started to grow again, you had to do something about it. And I don't believe that it is axiomatic that if you cut public spending, the private sector will step in to take its place. It's more likely when the economy is growing, for obvious reasons, but when the economy is not growing, as indeed it was growing in 2010, then it stopped again, then the risk is that you then go back into recession. Now, I would be surprised if this country goes back into recession as defined by 2 quarters of successive negative growth. I think is more likely to bump along the bottom. It might, zigzag a bit, but I'd be surprised if it did. But my worry has always been in this country that if you take too much money out of the economy too quickly, then it does crash the recovery. Now, in my defence of my position, I can tell you that, as I said, the economy actually grew more strongly in 2010 than we thought. It then stopped in 2011. We don't know what's going to happen this year. Of course, there's the overlay of what's happening in Europe, and that, as I said, is not entirely encouraging. But I do think that when you start taking public money out of the economy, it's a matter of judgment when you do it and the rate you do it. But as I say, I think unwittingly, the present government has ended up in a position that's not a million miles away from where we were going to end up, and that the deficit is likely to be eradicated at more or less the same time as we thought. So I just think they were, it's not so much taking the public money out. Remember, all the cuts are still to come through. The rhetoric they used in 2010 undoubtedly had an effect on people's confidence. If you tell businesses and individuals the world is going to hell, then it's not surprising you think, well, I'll just keep my money under the bed for a bit. I think that is a problem that I think they're now beginning to wake up to.
You mentioned confidence a couple of times. Do you think there are policies then? I mean, you say it's the general tenor of the debate, but are there things that government ought to be doing to boost confidence, or do you think that's too much of an intangible for it to really be something?
Well, I don't think there's any one thing. I mean, I think if you maybe people here who tell me different, who run businesses and so on, if you look at the outlook, it depends what you produce, of course. I think there are 3 things that I would look at. One is the American economy recovering? And the signs are at the moment is it may be slow, but it is, and they're producing a slightly different policy to the ones that we're producing on this side of the Atlantic. What's happening in Asia? Well, their economies are still growing, but their growth is slowing down. And I do worry about this point. I was thinking about China. There's an awful lot of money around there that at some stage that's going to be rectified. And Asian economies had a propensity in the past to go faster into a decline than the more mature economies. And then, of course, the big thing also is in Europe. Remember, half of what we do, produce goods and services, go to Europe. And when, if you really want to depress yourself, you ask yourself, where in Europe are our principal markets? And you discover that, Greece, Portugal, and Ireland are right up there at the top. You think, this isn't so good. Unless we see signs of recovery in Europe, then I think it's going to continue to depress things. But coming back to our country, it's partly language, but it's also, I mentioned things that you might want to do. I think we do need to do something about the squeezed middle and the incomes and so on. We do need to certainly need to arrest this growing problem of youth unemployment. But I think also just the signals you send in infrastructure, they're important. But frankly, another set of announcements aren't going to do the trick. Governments announce things all the time, and that's why people do actually become cynical. I think you need to see some evidence that something's happening. And conclude on this point, what we actually did in fiscal stimulus in 2008-9, in the scheme of things, was comparatively small, but it is the confidence thing. Let me give you one example: the car scrappage scheme. We were under pressure to basically bail out the car industry because in 2008 it was in a pretty thin time when people were saying, look, in America they're subsidizing wages, and in Germany they're subsidizing wages and all the rest of it. We didn't do anything like that, but we did a very simple thing which is actually pretty cheap in the scheme of things, and that was it gave an incentive to cash in, trade in your old car and buy a new one. It actually cost very little, but it made a huge difference to the confidence in the motor industry. And I mentioned the motor industry because that was something we were really good at 30 years ago. We still are. And the Nissan news this week is very, very good news. The names may have changed on the cars that we make, but actually this is something that we're quite good at. But that confidence measure, people in the motor industry will tell you it made a big difference. So it's an example of where governments can do things. They're not putting squillions of pounds into it, but they're actually sending a signal. And don't underestimate that.
Okay, top left. Actually, middle left. Let's keep going down. Keep going down. Someone on the end here. Why don't we go there? We want to go back in front of it.
Keisha Moore. I'm just an NHS doctor. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the risks of too tight a welfare net, developing a dependent population versus the need for redistribution of wealth.
So, could you tell what do you mean by too tight a net? Do you mean too much, too little, what?
Too much of a safety net,
right.
Developing a dependent population.
Right. This is one of these very difficult issues. When sometimes when politicians of all sides will make some generalizations. When you're confronted with a family with no money and children, as if you're a doctor in the NHS, I'm sure you've come across people like that. Your generalised feelings or your feelings of how did they get to this position, it's all very well, but you actually have a real problem in your hands at the present time. Take housing benefit, for example. Intuitively, it can't be right that the people who are working and struggling to make ends meet can't live in a big house, in Kensington or London, for example, and there are people because the housing benefit system might allow them to do that. So I think fairness and perceived fairness is very important. I think when you get to arbitrary benefit caps, again, there is a superficial attraction to saying, this is as far as you're prepared to go, and maybe we have got, beyond that, but suddenly trying to bring things back are going to cause other problems which which will have side effects that people don't actually like. I think on the broad principle, I think it's certainly important that work pays, and I think some of the changes the government's making to child benefit are now stopping that from happening. I have huge doubts about this universal credit, because the only way it can possibly work with no losers is you put a hell of a lot of money into it, or else you do have people who lose a lot of benefit. But I think you've got to have that incentive in the system that says you're better off in work than you're not. I think the other area where I think we do need to look at a lot more, which is much, again, it's difficult, particularly in relation to single people, to make sure your incentives are in there early on, and also in relation to disability benefits, where if you were inventing disability living allowance today, you would not have the system you got at the present time. And similarly, in relation to incapacity benefit, I, from 27 years of experience as a member of Parliament, I have people coming to see me, and I vary between how on earth did this person not get help, and other occasions think, well, how on earth did you get through all this? So it is difficult, but you've got to keep a balance in relation to those payments. Remember, the biggest thing that welfare payments include things like pensions, which people don't think of as welfare, but it is actually, because that's in the budget. I don't know if that helps you. I don't have an easy answer to it.
Okay, I think we're coming down to the front. One person on the end, just there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Harsha from Reading School. Alex Salmond has said that Scotland can stand on its own 2 feet, and also that Scotland actually provides more to Britain than Britain provides to Scotland. As a anti-independence campaigner, what would you say in response to this?
Well, I would always take with what he says with a pinch of salt, no matter what it is. Look, firstly, I don't think anyone could argue that Scotland or any other country can't go it alone. You can. You may have to accept certain consequences as a result of that, but you can. Now, I'm Scottish. I live in Scotland. I wouldn't argue that. And equally, I don't buy this argument that Scotland is a subsidy junkie and so on. It depends how you do the sums, like oil, for example. Which would hugely help successive British governments. Most of it happens to be within whatever way you divide it up in Scottish waters and so on. No, I think the correct way to look at this is from my point of view, what's best for Scotland. Now, I think we are better off being part of the United Kingdom, where we pool risk. There are some years we gain, some years you might lose if you want to do those sums. Just as I think Britain is better off within the European Union, where we've pooled sovereignty as well, as you know. And when you actually look at what Alex Salmond is saying, and although that is something that varies from time to time, because I know he was here 3 weeks ago, his policy, for example, on what currency an independent Scotland would have is now different to what it was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, we were going to be able to use the pound in the same way as Panama uses the dollar. But alive to the fact that people said, but that means your interest rates are fixed by a foreign government. His policy now is we're going to enter into a Stability and Growth Pact with the remaining part of the UK, which will mean that we can't move more than 3% in the structural deficit, which is remarkably like this pact they're signing in Europe at the moment. That means this independent Scotland would have to go cap in hand back to the remaining part of the UK and say, is our budget all right? And the other thing about a currency union is there's more than one person in it, and you've got to ask the other lot whether or not they want into it. And equally, on the question of lender of last resort, I was debating with a very senior member of the SNP last week, and at one point they weren't going to have a lender of last resort, which is the proud owner of 2 banks which have come to public notice in recent years. That seemed a bit odd, and then I was told that actually the Bank of England would be the lender of last resort, but we'd pay them some sort of annual fee. Now, you can imagine if you're the lender of last resort and you say, what is your bank? And we say, well, RBS. Have you ever made a claim in the last 5 years? It's not too difficult to see that the insurance premium might be on the hefty side. To be fair, Simon says that's not his problem. It's all the fault of London for letting it go, despite the fact that there is on record a letter from him to Fred Goodwin saying, I've looked at this deal, it's good for Scotland. And the only thing I would say in passing is that if he did look at it, he's the only person that did, because it seems that no one else did. I think that this is a classic case of where being part of a larger whole helps you. RBS had a balance sheet that is bigger than our GDP. I was able to underwrite it and HBOS in a way that the Irish government couldn't underwrite its 3 banks, because when people say, well, who's doing the underwriting? It's the Irish government just wasn't big enough. We mentioned Iceland earlier. So no, I don't argue you can't go it alone. What I do argue is that even Alex Salmond's model as of today, this isn't independence as I understand it. I mean, now, we're all part of the UK. We can argue about, how you divide up resources and so on. But the idea that I'd have to go to another government to get my budget approved, that seems a very odd idea of independence. I could go on for ages, and I'm afraid for those of you who are Scottish or taking interest in these matters, as we're not going to get a referendum until 2014, it will go on for ages. Why we're not having it until 2014? Well, there's one very simple fact. Alex Salmond, would no doubt boast the fact he is, a very astute gambler. He knows full well he'd lose if he went now. That's why we're not having a referendum just now. That's why we're having it in 2014. But just wait and see whether or not he ever does hold a referendum.
Okay, up on the far left, pass down the row there to the person hiding behind a computer screen.
Thank you. My name is Zhang Hong from China's Caixin Media. I want to ask a question on which Britain is at odds with the rest of Europe, which is the financial transaction tax. I think this is very controversial because the proponents will say, number one, it's morally required to do so, and number two, it's the financial transactions are such a huge tax base. Why not tap into it at a time of fiscal difficulties? But the opponents will say, number one, it's difficult to implement, and number two, it would drive a business out of the UK. So I wonder how you comment on both sides of arguments. Thank you.
Okay, look, if I'm not against it in principle, and we have a stamp duty in this country, which is a similar sort of thing. But the only way a financial transactions tax would work is if certainly the major parts of the world economy joined in. And the Americans won't, the Canadians won't, most Asian countries won't, and there isn't a split between us and Europe, I think. There is us and possibly France, because I think you'll find that most other European governments won't do it, and they talk about it, but they won't do it, precisely because they don't want to be disadvantaged. In France, I know that President Sarkozy has said that he's going to do it. I know that the French banks have said, hold on, no you're not. We'll wait and see. I've obviously got to wait and see if President Sarkozy is still the president, but we'll also have to wait and see if he is, what he actually does about it. If any Chancellor of the Exchequer, any finance minister, believe me, at this time, if they thought they could get money from a group of people who, generally speaking, the sympathy quotient is at a pretty low level, they would go for it. The idea, if I announced tonight, if I was in a position to announce anything, and I said, look, we're going to tax rich bankers, I mean, no one's going to stand up and say, oh, you mustn't, don't be too hard on them. Of course it would be popular. I just don't think it would work. And remember this, all you need to get around this is an atoll in the Caribbean and some sort of system for channeling money, and you're out of it. And I think this is which is why I'm not terribly optimistic about it. And I do think it's unfortunate. A lot of people are led to believe that it's an easy thing to implement, in terms of political agreement. It's not.
So one thing you might say that we've seen sort of two economic systems that have failed. One was socialism, which collapsed and people backed off. They sold off nationalised industries, and then there was a period of relatively free markets, and as a consequence of that, people now are beginning to have doubts about that. It looks to me as if there's no real vision, no big picture. I mean, there were people camping outside St. Paul's still recently who were meant to encourage us to think about an alternative vision of how an economy can be run. And I'm very struck by the discussion this evening being, in a certain sense, very conventional. We've talked about conventional economic policy. Is it your sense there really is, at this point, no alternative big picture view? And do you think that has a consequence for the way politics is conducted? Because historically we've had parties organised around competing principles, but it's hard to identify what those are at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, going back to the question that was asked a while ago, I think in the post-Second World War there was a greater ideological difference between people who practiced the free market. Though actually it wasn't as free as you conventionally in today's language call a free market. And query whether the Soviet Union was socialist. It seemed to me that in that country they swapped one form of oppression for another sort. And I think they used the word. It doesn't mean there was too much egalitarian about it. It was true that some people were more equal than others. That was it. And it's certainly true that in certainly post-70s there has been a far greater consensus. I think the argument actually today is what the role of government is, to what extent can it make a difference, should it make a difference, and so on. And I think that's striking about the, if you take the Occupy movement, is that there was no single coherent demand. There was a whole lot of different demands, and it was almost like an amalgam of different things. I'm not criticising them particularly because I don't think there is actually anyone at the moment who is arguing for, quotes, a completely different system. The capitalist system, one way or another, has survived for a rather long time. The question is how you manage it for the best advantage of people, how you manage things in your own country to ensure there is a degree of equity, a degree of fairness. What you do to secure advantage for your country. Those arguments will continue, but I don't have a simple answer. Nor, I haven't lived through a crisis like this before, but there's been other crises where people say there must be a better way. And so far, nobody has come up with an enduring better way. In particular, nobody's come up with a way of, at times dealing with the excessive exuberance of the human spirit, which can be very positive, but can also be very, very negative.
Well, with apologies to those who are unable to get in, I have to now draw the evening to a close, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that it's going to be an evening that lives on in the memory long afterwards. Extraordinarily candid and interesting comments from someone who was really involved intimately with all aspects of government policy over a prolonged period. I think we can all thank Alistair Darling for a very, very